So without further ado, I don't know if I can get this microphone off the stand. There she is. So I can get off the stage. So now I can hand the stage over to the social activism panel led by Ryan McAllister. Here's Ryan, come on up. So Ryan is a PhD research faculty at Georgetown University in biophysics, and he is a coordinator for notjustskin.org, and his mission is to bring awareness to circumcision, and he is a proponent of babies being born intact. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan. Thank you very much.
Actually, I've never seen a baby not born intact. So I just love families. I have a family. I have a daughter. She's 22. She has profound developmental differences. We live together. We always will. And that the bond between parents and children, whether you're born or you're adopted or whatever, is one of the most sacred things to me. And you know, in the 1970s, at least as recently as the 70s, experts, so-called experts, successfully convinced many families like mine to give their children over to institutions supposedly for care and supposedly so the families could go on living some kind of normal life, whatever that means. And today we've realized that institutionalization is a terrible thing. And so we've come a smidge in the direction of recognizing the importance of individuals, the importance of relationships, the importance of bonds, and the importance in variation between people. And yet, still, there are just these tremendous, disturbing disparities between the world that we have all the resources we need to create and the one in which we actually live. The terrible disparities by racial and other demographics. Did you know, by the way, that almost 3 million children in the United States have an incarcerated parent? The way that most families seem to be really struggling financially, the high rates of morbidity and complications in birth that are unnecessary, the massive number of interventions. And none of this is the failure sits on the shoulders of individual parents as failure somehow. These are systemic problems. These are because we have failed to create a social system that actually reflects our human values. And so that's what this panel is about. And systems are so complex. Our social system has become so complicated that no one human being can possibly hold it all in their minds. And so I hope we'll have a very, it seems like I'm much louder when I turn this way. I'm so sorry. I hope we'll have a very engaged discussion. So I want to introduce you to some colleagues in this work. And actually, I think this is a room full of colleagues in this work, which is why I'm actually quite intimidated, like supposedly moderating this panel for which I am vastly underqualified to moderate.
Yeah, Ryan,
yes.
you're being a moderator. Don't admit it, man.
Well, I just think, you know, that it's overwhelming probably for any of us. We get to all sit together and talk some, and it's anyway. Let me introduce you to some of these folks. So on my immediate left is Shatia Owsley Humphrey. She is by day a corporate trainer, but I think her passions lie in a lot of other areas. She's finishing up a master's of science in health promotion and community health care. Her research focuses on how race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, environmental conditions, and stressors affect birth outcomes of women of color, especially African American women. She's a birth doula and postpartum doula, a parenting coach, and a family life consultant. And I've managed to get all my pages out of order. She started her career providing pediatric medical case coordination at health services for children with special needs. She saw there how the racial and cultural disparities within the healthcare system affected many minority families in underserved areas in the Washington, D.C. area. And she's also worked as a maternal child health program manager at St. Anne's Infant and Maternity Home, managing daily operations of the 21-bed residential teen mother baby program. So what I want to do is give everybody like that little intro of some of their experiences, and then ask a personal question and go down the line, and then we'll just start chatting, and maybe you'll all join us. Um, do you want to talk about like one of your experiences trying to inform and help re-empower women of color?
Sure. For me, it started as a personal experience. I have a 2.5-year-old rambunctious little boy. And I went into my birth knowing what I wanted, or at least I thought I knew what I wanted. And so I walked in with a birth plan, and I said, this is what I want. And my birth plan was looked at and kind of tossed to the side, and everything I didn't want is what I got. So when I left, I said it has to be a different way. And so I took that time to start researching and really speaking to families about their birth experience to see if I was the only one who had gone through the experience that I went through. And I learned that I was not the only one. But what really hit close to home to me was speaking with African American women about their birth experiences and not knowing the options that were available to them. And so listening to the panels today helped me to understand that it's a much bigger issue, especially in the African American community, because I think many of us have in our mind that there's a way of having a baby or giving birth, and it's supposed to be in a hospital, and you get an epidural, and you have your baby, and that's the way it's supposed to be. And I remember going into the hospital and them saying to me, you don't have to experience any pain. We can give you an epidural right now. And I said, but I'm not in any pain. I don't feel anything. I'm okay. They said, it's okay. You don't ever have to feel any pain. And I said, I don't think this is, but I knew just from my own research, the damaging effects of getting an epidural and speaking to other moms of different relaxation techniques and different ways to give birth. You need to get up and move around. You need to be able to have birth your way. It should be beautifully designed the way you want it to be. And so it has been a struggle because I think we have been programmed to have birth a certain type of way. But I am invested and I am committed to the work of researching and talking to moms and really giving them the opportunity to design the births that they want and empowering them. And so I will say it's been a struggle, but as the months and the days that I am writing papers and working with moms and talking to moms and interviewing moms about their birth experiences, I see there's a shift and I see a change. And being with all of you today helps me know that there's a community out there working and pushing for all moms, especially women of color, to have the births that they want to have. So,
thank you. So, and then to T's left is Kamala. She's a birth companion and founder and curator of Birth to Birth Talks, which is a series of public symposiums she's been organizing in Germany, engaging healthcare professionals, policymakers, cultural influencers, and parents on the long-term impacts of the current practices that we have. She also co-founded Fearless Birth Film Festival Fund. She's a contributor to Huffington Post on global motherhood and the state of maternity care options available to millennials and beyond, which means you must have to write a lot, I would imagine. And is a speaker at the Long Night of Ideas, Unlearning the Given, Exercises in Demodernity and Decoloniality of Ideas and Knowledge, an initiative of the German Foreign Office. So I guess a logical question to start by asking you is, would you like to share one of the personal experiences that drew your attention to how obstetrics is behaving in a colonial manner these days?
Yes. So you mentioned that recently I was invited to speak by, there's a cultural institute. It's an art institute that was founded by a man from the Ivory Coast, but he's really important curator at the moment, art curator. and he worked together with the German Foreign Office to introduce an idea that allows us to look at art and public discourse beyond the normal frameworks or the normal audiences they imagine that are able to participate in culture creation. And when I met him, he asked me, so what do you do? Or who are you? Which is a very common question in the art world. And for me, I understood that birth belongs to all of us and not just a question or a theme that should be contained in the realms of medicine or parenthood, but that it impacts the way we all engage in the rest of society as we know how we encounter each other. It has to do with violence. There are many intersections where birth has an impact. So what I wanted to do was talk about human birth beyond human time, so that we could look at how birth used to happen in places that are not impacted by allopathic medicine or modern ways of giving birth. And so, so in the talk, or at the end of the talk, a woman was present who lives in Namibia, and she does work on looking at the genocides, German genocides that were perpetrated in Namibia. And she said that there are lots of different things that they're looking at in terms of the repercussions of the genocides, but how they give birth was something that was still able to fall into this kind of post-colonial or a colonial way of introducing ideas from the outside into Namibian culture. So the way a person learns to care for others or provide maternity care in Namibia reflects something that has nothing per se to do with Namibian bodies of knowledge, let's say, to do with the way a group of people would have given birth, let's say, 5,000 years ago. And so what she wanted to do, or what she sort of deduced from this talk that I gave, was that that today there are lots of NGOs in Namibia and all over sub-Saharan Africa who are introducing new models of practice. And she herself had a mother who's a midwife, and what she wanted was to look at how is what her mother is learning and then teaching women about birth, how is that impacted by this colonial past or this sort of colonial models of learning. So what I mentioned in the talk, The Long Night of Ideas, Unlearning the Given, I looked at universal mythologies that surround birth, and one of them is the obstetric dilemma, which the first panel talked about. One of the speakers, Dave Paxson, I think his name, is in the first panel, talked about this idea that when humans began to stand upright and became bipedal, their pelvis sizes became smaller, and the brain, the neocortex or the frontal lobes began to grow too big to fit through the pelvis. And so this was something that I've heard in many, many places. And I started to do research, as I often do. I think the power of the personal story is important, but I also spend a lot of time doing research to answer questions that I'm still curious about. And I found a paper from 2012, printed in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, which was a collaboration between the University of College London, Boston University, and Cambridge University, which questioned the obstetric dilemma. And their conclusion was that actually diet or ecological factors had more impact on the outcomes of birth than this kind of universal idea that humans can no longer birth. And part of their conclusion, or part of their research, was to look at two bodies or two populations. So one were people from agricultural societies, and the other were people from forager societies. And from these two bodies, they saw that forager societies always had a lower perinatal mortality rate and less complications in birth. So part of the talk was to look at why is this the case, because there are plenty of factors that could be responsible. Diet is one, but the other, what kind of environments do they give birth in? And from our first panel, we could see that there are a lot of things that you could do to reduce this kind of expectation of a complicated birth, or kind of information and things that look more at physiology, at birth physiology. And in those places where people have forager lifestyle, diets, they actually, where's my thought? In those places, they're more in tune with nature, natural rhythms. They eat what they need to and don't create excess. They have to rely on their instincts because they're living in places where they could be confronted immediately with dangers, whether that have to do with the weather or predators in the area. So to close, to kind of conclude, is to say that it's really, I wanted to ask myself, how do we keep asking questions? Because all of us here have gotten to a point beyond the limits of what we found in allopathic medicine by asking questions. But then we all have new questions that are coming upon us, and how do we find ways to ease into those? So for me, I wanted to look at a place like Namibia, and I have other personal examples where people can look to what is useful in allopathic medicine, but then remember that we can also go backwards, which is to practices and places in the world where things are still okay for the most part. Although they may not have a cesarean when it's necessary, the rest of their model, we can question what works more often than what is problematic before we impose new models of activity, or new models of practice in those places. Mm-hmm. Long answer to your question.
And I forgot to say your full name, which is Kamalo Gaskin. So
yeah.
Apologies for.
No.
Thank you. And then to Kamalo's left is Ken Johnson, who I suspect a lot of people have read some of Ken's research. He's an epidemiologist with over 30 years of experience, and was on the very important MANA study of CPMs of over 5,000 planned home births, doing direct entry in the US and Canada, demonstrating the safety. His work over the last 3 decades has revolved around the crucial role of epidemiological evidence in supporting home birth and midwifery practices. And right now he's actually focusing on standing breech birth, or upright position breech birth, not necessarily standing. So Ken, how has living with a direct entry home birth midwife impacted your personal involvement with or understanding of the topic.
25 years living with a direct entry home birth midwife. Being in the community, being involved with the midwife, of course, and as an epidemiologist, got me involved in home birth research very early because I was drawn to the passion of home birth midwives about what an awesome thing home birth was before I'd had a birth. But of course, when I asked the midwife about the evidence for the safety of home birth, their explanations weren't as compelling as I might have wanted as an epidemiologist. At the same time, when I got involved in this community, I realized how many incredibly powerful, brazen women, whether doulas, midwives, or researchers, were in this community and how incredibly strong they were. I've always loved the expression, well-behaved women rarely create history. And it's very clear that midwives are home birth midwives are not well-behaved women. Hallelujah. So I realized from my epidemiologic perspective that in a culture so dominated by science, apparently dominated by science and evidence, as well as turf and power, that I didn't know how to solve the power problem, but the evidence thing was you could move the discussion always from just opinion. If you're talking about home birth, whether it's safe or not, and a midwife says thinks it's safe, and an obstetrician says it's not safe, of course, because the obstetricians have more power, they tend to win on that argument. If you move it to a discussion of the evidence of home birth safety, then you move the yardsticks completely. And you may not, and the obstetrician won't necessarily come to your opinion, but the women may easily, because they'll realize when sensible things are being said. And Marshall Klaus famously said that opinion divides and data unites. And I think it's very, very true still. Not that we've had, although we still have a huge problem with the obstetric community and power. I was encouraged today by the work of Kathleen, amazing work about breastfeeding and trauma, and Raylene's evidence around neonatal. It always reminds me just how important that neonatal period is. It'd be incredible just to look at life outcomes based on how many hours a woman is away from her, or child is away from her mother right from the start. And it just blows my mind when I think about the fact that many of us of the older generation were away from our mothers for days at the beginning of life, which is just shocking. I'm also impressed with other people. Betty Ann, my colleague, has just tirelessly worked on research, anthropology, sociology, home birth, and now vaginal breech birth. And being her partner, I find out after every birth what happened. When she's at home, they always seem to work out just fine. When she's in hospital, there's often conflict with the obstetrician, who just has a different opinion and usually not based on evidence. And I just realized how many battles every woman involved in challenging the paradigm deals with relentlessly, and my hat's just always off to them. I'm endlessly in awe of and meet so many incredible women that do this kind of work. Suzanne has been doing this work since she went to hospital at age 20 with her first baby. 27 wrote her first book. Yeah, I could do that. That would be my pleasure. Okay. And I probably should. I'm getting that from you. I just want to mention one other person that's in the room is Pam Morath, who supported our home birth research on the CPM 2000 study. She provided a lot of not only strategic thing, but also how, in terms of the resources, she was instrumental in us getting resources to be able to complete that study of more than 5,500 or more than 5,000 planned home births. And I'm pleased to say we published that, we were lucky enough to get it published in the British Medical Journal, 20 seconds, more than a decade ago, and it has been downloaded as a PDF more than 200,000 times, and that just gives me incredible encouragement that the remarkable amount of sweat we put into that, because Pam didn't get nearly as much money as we would have liked, but that's all, that would have been.
And the American Medical Journal's
Rejected.
it out of hand. They would not. Luckily, the British Medical Journal has more prestige than any of the journals
So
in
it's
the
still
United
being
States.
downloaded almost 1,000 times a month, and obviously that means there's still a lot of North American women who are taking evidence into consideration when they decide where to have their birth. Thank you.
Thank you. And what? Well, and then to Ken's left is Suzanne Arms, who might, of anyone, need the least introduction. She is a multi-specialist, a generalist, a birth anthropologist, self-made, a birth photographer, a speaker, an activist, an organizer, an integrator, and morale supporter for many of us. Yes, yes, a multip author. And yeah, I had the good fortune to meet Suzanne somewhere, like 2004 maybe. It's been a while. When we were both younger, but you're still just as energetic. I'm impressed. Anyway, thanks for basically, being one of the center organizers of this whole event. Is there anything you wanted to get to say that you haven't already today, or do you want us to jump into the chatting?
About this panel.
Yes, but be careful, because I know how much you have to say.
I am passionate about the intersection of the different issues that come to bear on birth, and how really it is the nexus point of every major way of looking at the world, whether it's philosophically, economically, spiritually, sexually, in terms of hormones, in terms of brain development, in terms of male-female relationships, in terms of politics. It all comes to bear on how a woman births and how a baby is born. And I've been passionately interested in the fact that the mother and baby have been looked at as two separate units for many, many years, ever since the woman was drugged senseless in the early teens, 1918, 1920, when twilight sleep began, and she was literally incapable of touching or holding her baby because she was often unconscious for up to 3 days, but definitely 8 to 24 hours. And then the baby was taken away and had to be cared for, and was cared for in a newborn nursery. That's where the separation of mother and baby began. And it wasn't the doctors who were caring for the babies, it was the nurses. And big nurse, as she was known, ended up running the nursery. So even pediatricians like Marshall Klaus in the 50s couldn't get into the nursery if the nurse didn't want them there. But it was all based on separation, and you can understand that women began to look down on women caring for their own babies, and began to marginalize the mother. And these nurses were often mothers themselves. So when we talk about colonization, and we talk about colonization of a woman's body as much as the colonization of a people or the suppression of a people, we're also talking about many different factors coming to bear on her and this baby. And for many years, we have looked at the baby and the mother as separate, with separate interests, and people have either been pro-baby or pro-mother. And often you'd find pediatricians talking about how, well, I care about the baby, and to which, when I was at conferences for pediatricians or obstetricians in the 1970s, I couldn't hold my anger, just like Gabrielle, who comes here with her own fierceness, and I'd usually stand up and say, "Who cares about the baby? Where are you at 2 in the morning when this baby is screaming and the dad's at work and the mother isn't able to breastfeed and there's nobody there? You tell me you care about the baby?" Oh, and I'd look around me and I'd be just absolutely beat red from my own rage, which of course had to do with the fact that my mother was separated from me, and that usually would stun the room. Or it was in England when I was the featured speaker at a number of places in England, and I took my obstetrician then partner with me. And they would always talk to the obstetrician, but not to me, as if I wasn't the invited speaker. And so I'd be with a room full of obstetricians, and Don Creevy, by the way, was a super supporter of midwives, and backed midwives in 5 counties for 30 years for home birth. Loved home birth. And And I'd get the same thing, from obstetricians. Well, I talk about trauma, I talk about separation of mother and baby, I talk about obstetric interventions and what it did to people. And there'd always be a chief of obstetrics from Oxford or some other place who'd stand up and say, well, we were all born that way, and fine with us. and would come right through me, and it was like, yeah, well, you're the walking wounded. What about the ones who were in institutions who didn't do so well when their mother's legs were held together and their heads would push back with every contraction? That was my birth I was talking about, right? So I have carried a particular toward the external forces that come to bear that shape birth. And it was a real blessing when I met Michel Audant, because he was always trying to strip away what was added to birth and to say, well, what if we didn't do this? What if we didn't do this? And I remember, when I first went to France to see him work at the suggestion of Mary Jackson, a midwife, in 1983, I think it was, he grabbed me by the hand. He ran all the way down the stairs of the hospital. There was a woman in active labor, grabbed me by the hand. Come, you must watch. I want to see. You must see what is happening. She is so far along, it's no problem. Otherwise, I would not take you in to see. She needs the privacy, right? So I got to see this woman birthing on her own, standing up, squatting. I got to see her naked. And he made these so-called primitive rooms for the women who were educated, for the nurses, and the others who came. The farmers' wives didn't need it. They were doing okay. But the educated women were having the problems. And he reminded me of the pieces I didn't know. So many people reminded me of the pieces I didn't know. In his case, it was the cocktail of hormones that brings about normal birth, and about the critical importance of privacy. So I come with a real passionate interest in people caring about all the things that intersect at the beginning of life. And my family, and I would suggest your families, have some of the same history that comes to bear. And I'll just give you a thumbnail. My grandmother Ida, Russian Jew, 4'10", deaf. A very small minority of women who grew up feeling very isolated because she could not hear the human voice, did not know what people were saying. She was raised in an Orthodox religious family. In her case, it happened to be Jewish. She was taught nothing about her body, and she went to birth in a hospital, and the external force was World War I. There were no nurses on duty. Some kind nurse thought she would protect her by locking her in the labor room so that she couldn't wander the halls and get to some other part of the hospital. So my grandmother Ida, 4'10", deaf, labored alone in a hospital room, locked, with every contraction thinking she was dying. And by the time she had her second baby, which was 14 months later, and she didn't know how to do contraception because nobody talked to her about sex education or her body, and there was no contraception available, she determined she would never have another child. So for the rest of Ida's life, Ida, Jew, married to a Roman Catholic, with the priest coming every week wanting to know, not every week, every couple of months wanting to know why they weren't having more children, would dutifully, to her body, abort herself with everything she could find, from knitting needles to quinine, you name it. So there's sex education, there's suppression, there's religion, there's World War I, right? So she gives birth to my mother. Does she tell her anything about birth? No. The only thing my mother knows about birth is she visits her best friend in the hospital who's just had a baby under twilight sleep. Ida, no twilight sleep, no drugs, just alone, isolated, terrified. Her friend, who had had it under twilight sleep, my mother goes in as a teacher, educated. She says, "That was the worst experience of my life." That's my mother's birth education, right? So she labors with my brother under twilight sleep and gives birth to a baby that was so jittery that the doctor said he'd never seen such a hyperreactive baby. And of course, he was a Virgo with a sensitive Pisces rising, Cancer moon, super sensitive, genius male who ended up killing himself, having been circumcised after birth, never feeling anybody was there to protect him, ever. And, comes time, Saturn returned, Age 28, he kills himself. Happened to be on my birthday. So there's birth trauma in my family, and my mother, did she talk to me about birth? No, except to say, take the drugs, right? She didn't tell me about Grandma Brady. I didn't know that Ida, who is Ida Sulnutzer, had had her, that way. She didn't tell me that her legs were held together when I was about to be born because the doctor refused to come because it was a Tuesday. So, the story goes on and on. My head was pushed back with every contraction. So, of course, when people start to push on me, or pressures from the outside world push on me, like preparing for this conference, I collapse. I just completely collapse like I did trying to get out of the womb. Push, 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 trying to be born, head against my head, pushing me back, uterus pushing me down. It's too much, and I collapse. I get dragged out, I get separated 3 days, and there was an epidemic of infant diarrhea in the nursery. They didn't know that it was caused by separation of the mother and baby, so they separated them further. It was caused by World War II. There were no nurses on the ward. So when I say environment influences, this is even before we understand about toxin chemicals and everything else. I'm talking about things like religion, sexism, war, secrets and lies in families. And it goes on and on and on until I, at age 22, after my brother killed himself, said, and I don't even remember why, something in me rose up and said, I will end the violence and abuse and lack of protection in my family, or I will die trying. But at the age of 10, I had said I was going to save the world for children. Why? I don't know. It came through me because our birth imprints us so deeply. So that's why I'm on this panel. I love this panel.
So you've done a good job of illustrating how these social forces form feedback loops that sort of roll through time and roll over all of us. And we've named a number, between all of us, we've named a number of the social forces that I think we would like to de-escalate, like normalization, institutionalization, colonization, racism, sexism, separation. What are some of these social forces that we want to either amplify or create anew that could create different feedback loops? And I think we're going to have, I think we've got about till 1:40, is that right?
144, 145.
So I want to give us a few minutes to think about this question or give our answers, and then I want to open up to a broader discussion. So try to keep yourselves very short. We've actually used half of our time on the introductions, which was not my hope. So what do you think? What are some social forces that we want to generate or strengthen?
All right, well, everybody's thinking. I want to end patriarchy. I want to end patriarchy. This is my husband's campaign, Bob Hartman, born to a mother who should have had an abortion, but she didn't want a child and she couldn't stop.
Okay, so tell me the social force you want to put in it.
The
What do you
social
want it
force
to
is
become?
patriarchy.
No, the positive social force you want to
Positive
create.
social force is a new paradigm. It's not matriarchy. It is a cooperative way of looking at the world through the left and right side of the brain, through the different archetypes, and through the critical importance of men and women working together to balance each other and to enhance each other. But I want to see the vulnerability of boys supported. I want to see the fragile male get what he needs. And boy babies are so much more fragile. At 6 weeks, no, at term, a full-term healthy baby, boy and girl, completely matched, that boy is 6 weeks less developed physiologically than the girl, and he will never catch up. He is more susceptible to trauma. He is more likely to act out with trauma or act in terms of rage and addiction. And it's because we try to toughen up boys. We tell people that women shouldn't sleep with their boys, they shouldn't breastfeed longer. Boys need longer breastfeeding, they need to be picked up longer. Everybody needs it. They need longer skin to skin. They need no shaming, they get more of it. And we got to stop toughening up boys because it makes brittle men, and brittle men perpetrate the violence on women and children around the planet, and I'm fed up with it. And I surround myself with great men, and it's really hard because they get it, but the men who don't get it are the ones who are perpetrating in the world. And it's the secret that nobody talks about. Everybody talks about violence against women. Who does it? Men do it. And they do it because they did not get their needs met primally. So bravo to my husband, Bob Hartman, the unwanted child, who grew up to find that there's a reason for him to be alive. And I want to end patriarchy. And I want to replace it with men getting their needs met.
Nonviolence, gentleness, and cooperation, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So the same question for all of us.
To the extent you're willing, or you can jump off from each other.
That something that carries off from what Suzanne is saying. Recently, I started to write an article titled, "Are Women the Best Mothers?" And this was after noticing all the ways from the time that you become pregnant until you send your kids off to college or whatever you do in your country when the child turns 18. And essentially, there are a lot of things to help support women during this kind of period, the childbearing years and also the years as a mother, that enable them to feel secure in their decisions to go about making decisions to care for that child and sort of connect to their instincts as a mother. And I was writing the article after two authors in Germany, where I live in Berlin, in Germany. Two authors published a book called Die Abschaffung der Mutter, which would roughly translate to the eradication of the mother. And they were specifically looking at the German situation, but I think this has a lot of parallels all over, where women during the pregnancy, they get a lot of information, but it's very important to look at how the information is transmitted so that the women know that what we all know, that there is this kind of instinct. They come with a function or an internal package, if you will, or Julie Bonaparte talks about internal resources that allow that birth to happen or to allow them to later breastfeed and connect to the baby. And they would go in this direction anyways, but getting so much information that tells them that they have to rely on outer forces to inform them what they should do, I think does a disservice to them being able to be powerful, meaningful, or build powerful, meaningful, dynamic relationships with children over time. Another aspect that I was looking at is that in the book launch, at the launch of this book, there were a series of women who were in the room who were not women, who were not current day mothers, but they were mothers in the 1970s and 80s. And they had never had a chance to speak about this moment, this historical moment where their children were taken away from them by the East German government under the guise of feminism. So they wanted to give mothers the power to work by giving them the feminist placard, but taking away their children. And it's really important for me to see that feminism isn't framed as something that is counter to our innate desire to have relationships with others as mothers, because there's feminism as women, we do come with parts of ourselves that are important to come to fruition and live out. And so what I wanted to do was to look at where we are in the States, because I'm also, part of me is always here, that we see that once we get to the next level where we have maternity and paternity leave available universally, and you get 14 months off for paid leave for both parents. Once you get to that point, that you also realize that there are some things that are not to be compromised, that we have, we're on the one hand fighting for lots of things, but just to look ahead to see how do we make sure that that each stage we get to, we are trying to strengthen this relationship where the woman is actually at the center of the decisions that will impact her long term as well as her children. I can stop there, but there's much more in this conversation that respond to your question.
I very much appreciate your point that success at achieving gender equality isn't like replicating the way we damage men onto women. Like,
Exactly.
we want to stop doing that damage to men and stop doing damage to women.
Right.
Not just like even the playing field by mushing everyone.
Right.
Well, thank you.
One of the things that I find a challenge is everybody wants to move to solutions too fast for me. I want to tease out what the problems are enough that people really are aware so that we can move toward the solutions with the whole picture. So although the fourth panel is going to look at solutions, I'd like to keep looking at the nature of the problem, which I know everybody wants to ignore. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of it, but in the early 1940s, late 1940s, early 50s, when babies were getting infant formula that was not even as good as today, and a lot of artificial foods, they were fairly constipated. It was a big deal if you could get your child on chopped meat really early. And at cocktail parties in the early 60s, mothers would talk about, and fathers would talk about, how early their baby son was on meat. And pediatricians in the late 40s and early 50s told parents that they needed to give enemas to their child. How many of you are aware of that? That children were held down, babies were held down, and children were given routine enemas, sometimes every day, by parents who were overzealous and had their own issues about violence and were perpetrating rape on their children. And they were doing this at the behest of pediatricians who also told them not to pick up babies when they cried, not to sleep with them, and not to bottle feed them. It was breastfeed them. It was a pediatrician who told my mother, the same woman who he told was the most agitated baby he'd ever seen was my brother. When my mother wanted to breastfeed, he said, "Eleanor, you're a school teacher, not a cow." So shame has been used over and over and over again against women and babies to perpetrate, and that is the medical establishment, and the men and the women in the medical world who had it perpetrated on them, and then they become perpetrators. So I really want us to tease out the problems with this panel. Nobody else is going to do it.
Okay. Did you want to get to say anything, T?
Suzanne, I just formulated my three-pronged solution answer to that question of Ryan's, and you've just ruined it.
Oh, go ahead. You can do it. You can say it. Yeah.
Okay, number one, I think with T talking about how birth plans get thrown out, I think the whole world should know about the Deborah Pascali-Bonero technique for getting what you want in the hospital. Deborah, I will keep it the shortest birth story ever because I don't remember all the details, but she was in Montreal with having her first baby, and when they threw out her birth plan, she locked herself in the washroom and refused to come out until someone would attend to her who would give her what she wanted. Now, if we could universally teach that, I think we could really shift things. Number two,
Strong Italian women.
Strong Italian women, that helps. Number two, Ryan's videos. Ryan's done two beautiful videos that he didn't even mention. Yeah. Ryan McAllister, you can find it. One's called De-Breaking Birth. Unbreaking, I'm sorry. Extraordinary half-hour video. It has a huge amount of evidence in it and very nicely presented. And then he has one on circumcision, which is equally extraordinary and talks a lot about the problem, Suzanne. So that's the problem side and solution. Well, the solution's pretty easy on that one. On a physiologic level.
What's the third?
Yeah.
The third is Betty Ann's and Robbie Davis's work on models that work. Birth models that work, which is over, you can go over, look, there's a few copies on the table, but Betty Ann's also and Robbie have just about finished a new volume that's models that are more progressive and a little less established, but a whole nother book with a whole bunch more models and discussion of some of the models from the last one. I think that's
So
3.
there, you have some good solutions.
And the fourth thing was, it'll be just as short, the fourth one is we've talked in Birth Keepers about extending, Hillary and Bernie are busy talking about changes in health care, and we, as Birth Keepers, we've talked about the first place they should extend care is to all mothers and babies.
Medicare.
And being from Medicare, being from Canada, having universal not-for-profit health care, it's just remarkable that we could even be having to talk about that. But when that happens, then in Canada, midwifery got legalized because it was a solution to reduce the cost of healthcare, which was one of the things as a society we wanted to do. And so we've ended up with access to midwifery care for probably more than 90% of Canadian women, and they can choose whether they want a home, birth center, or hospital birth, and whether they want an OB or a midwife. And that could come here. It's exactly the same midwives. I know many of them from Canada, I know many from the US. They all practice very similarly, and there's no reason that couldn't be introduced here.
Thanks, Ken. So we have 10 minutes left total. I want to make sure Tia has a chance to say something before we go to questions.
Okay.
Whatever you want to say.
One of the things that I have noticed, and I also have been focusing on in my research, is the dad. We spend a lot of time talking about the mom and talking about the baby, and oftentimes dads are really left out. And it really hit close to home to me after I had my son. And my husband, for the first week, I would say, didn't know what to do. And I could tell he was going through a difficult time and having a hard time, but he had nowhere to turn and no one to talk to. And although I was there, all of the attention from family and friends was being focused on me and the new baby and not to him. And so maybe 3 months after I had my son, we had a conversation, and he said, I don't think people really understand what dads go through after their wife has a baby. There's no one for us to go to. There are no support groups for us to talk to. And we are made to be the providers and not be vulnerable. We're supposed to just take it all in. We provide, we take care of you. And him being an African-American man as well, he said it's just difficult. It's difficult and it's hard. And so I started to question, how do we support our dads? How do we help them birth as well as the mom is birthing? And where do they get the resources from? And so we have to create the resources for them. And so my time in between helping moms has also been talking to dads as well as about what is it that you need. And a lot of the times I get the response, well, no one's ever asked me what I need. Does anyone care what I need and where I can get services and where I can get support? And I think it is understudied, it is not looked at, and it's an opportunity for us to really focus on them, but it should also be a time where we are also connecting the woman and her partner together, to come together. And a lot of times we see them drift apart instead of bridging that gap and being the support for one another in this time. And so I think that, Suzanne, going back to focusing on problems, is one of the problems that we need to really tackle and we really need to look at, is really how do we bridge the gap and how do we bring dads to the forefront to say, we are here for you and we are here to support you, and we want it to be, want you to know that we are looking for you to have the emotional support that you need. Because if they don't have it and they have sons, it's a cyclical cycle. It continues to repeat itself over and over again. And if we don't address it, we will continue to create these men who are not vulnerable, who are not emotional, and it's an important problem that I think that we also need to focus on as well.
I mean, even in Africa, when I went to Ethiopia, I would see the women were learning sex education songs, contraception songs. They were gathering together. The girls were there. The boys were not invited. They were outside, And it's the boys who perpetrate the violence when they grow up, but they weren't talk about the sacredness of their role or the sacredness. And once in a while, you'll find a tribe in Africa that would nurture its boys by having them make mud dolls and care for those babies. But that's an unusual tribe. Most of them are still patriarchal in the sense of dominating women.
So we have these 4 amazing panelists and about 4 minutes. Does anyone have a question for one of them?
We have a little more time.
You have an argument then with...
10 minutes.
For Susanna minutes, or are you talking about Ryan minutes?
It's stretchable minutes.
That's right. So I see
That little
we've got
orange
one
light
here,
up there.
1, 2, 3. So I've got 1, 2, 3
You-
on this
can you
side.
just-
Were there any questions over on that side, Ryan?
Can you just do it?
Yeah.
Fine.
Were there any hands over on this side? Because I
Yes,
could not
Claudia
see.
has a hand.
Okay, so what we want to do is encourage you to have a question for the panel, okay, and keep them concise.
And you hand me the mic if you only knew who I was. That'll be hard. So I'm going to make it short. But knowing that you are here in front of ACOG, or this is a counter discussion to ACOG, which is the power structure of there's this kind of counterpart. I would like to hear your voice as it relates to market-driven society. You have a market. We are in a commodity-driven we're in a culture that is influenced by markets. What can we do if you're looking out 7 generations and we want to make the change that you're talking about? What can we do if you've got 60% of the people in here are midwives who are often in their own businesses? What single change can you recommend that could influence 7 generations down the pipeline so that can shift in the market so that we can attract people to us as opposed to push against what we don't want? Let's attract what we want. What can you suggest us to do, those of us that are running our own businesses?
I can start to respond to that. It's a question that I've had as well, because I think if we are moving away from hospitals, which are kind of the center of the market or the obstetrics market, if we're having people move away from this because they're not getting knowledge or knowledgeable care providers, that's not good for any market. And what we had Betty Ann talking about is breech birth. We'll take that as one example. With breech, we already know that anyone who was practicing before the 1960s as an obstetrician probably knew how to care for a breech or kind of attend a breech delivery. And slowly that's become less and less common. I have a story from my personal archive that gives you, or would give anyone at ACOG a kind of indication of why it's important for this kind of knowledge to be respected and integrated into their practice. My sister was pregnant with twins. One of her twins ended up being breech, or she found out the twin was breech. She went to the hospital for 5 months of her pregnancy. Each visit was a maximum of 15 minutes, and she got absolutely no confidence that any of her providers knew anything about either twin or breech birth. So she was in a situation where she was told, this is your best option, but she was not given any information that gave her any confidence in that knowledge. So what I recommended, and people around her who knew what kind of information you get from midwives, is that midwives are really dedicated to research because they have to actually have faith that they can perform something that cannot be performed somewhere else. So at some point, she went to a midwife in the Bay Area in California, and after sitting with that midwife for 1 hour, she got more information about her situation than she had had in 5 months. So in terms of business, I can see that business is going in the direction of out-of-hospital birth. So if you want all of your clients to kind of migrate away from whatever your institution is, I wouldn't recommend you keep your practitioner, staff, experts ignorant. And in order to do this, you need to gravitate towards the people who know more about that. And in our given kind of state of the world, breach is only known by people who work outside of these normal paradigms, or people who are just in places where they have no access to any other option. And you can also see this with home birth, that those who attend home births end up having a lot more knowledge about unattended births than others. And just a quick reference, she mentioned Michel Audin, and I think he said in his own life, he's 85 at the moment, after 15,000 births in hospitals, somebody asked him to attend a home birth, and for the first time he had seen things that he had never witnessed in the hospital environment. So that tells us there's a whole body of knowledge that as a business, let's say, you cannot neglect going where knowledge is growing, rather than narrowing things down to practices where complications are increasing. That's quite, I think, as customers inform themselves, that model is just not going to work anymore. So,
Thank you. Just to add to what Kamala said, and I'm sorry, I don't know what your name is, but Chadden. I think what's going on for me, a lot of what's going on is the marketization of a dictatorship, and it's a dictatorship around corporate medicine. And one of the things that happened to me that was extraordinary in Oxford, I went to talk about breach. I'm glad you brought it up again. And I talked to Dr. Impey, who was the head of the Radcliffe Infirmary. He works in Oxford. And I said, you know, Dr. Impey, when we were bringing back breach to Montfort, which is our hospital in Ottawa, I said, I know you're talking about a dictatorship, but we didn't necessarily use that. And our nurse manager said, Betty Ann, you know, you don't have to get everybody convinced. We're going to give you privileges to do this because we can see what you're doing. And so Dr. Impey said to me, oh, no, we're not going to do that. No, this is a dictatorship. We are going to have all the consultants do this. And I said, well, you know, it's really interesting because we are experimenting with something in Canada in a hospital, which is a little unusual in a Western industrialized hospital. And it's an experiment called democracy. And I said, really?
Have you heard of that down here in the United States?
Yeah, have you heard it?
Democracy.
And so what I said to him was, you know, our head of obstetrics opened this up and he said to the women, what do they want? And they said, we want our midwives at our births. We want our births in a place where we feel safe. And suddenly everything started falling away. All of the arguments started falling away because what they felt was the doctors who really don't want to do breaches don't have to. And they don't have to feel that they're going to be sued because those crazy midwives are going to do those births and let them do it. But the other thing that happened that was really important was I said, you know, for a really good democracy, you have to have an educated electorate. And an educated electorate means that you have to inform women about might happen to them and what could happen to them, what could happen to their babies. So Dr. Impey, we give a 4 or 5 hour lecture to everybody. He says, oh, I don't think we could do that here. We don't do that. We don't have midwives that do that. And then he said, keep in mind, this is Oxford, he said, we don't have it. I don't think we have the educated midwives and the education here in our town to do what we need to do. I'm going, Dr. Impey, you live in Oxford. Like,
right.
So for me, that is what we're dealing with here, is this marketization and manufacture of a problem.
I want to say one other thing. You cannot have a discussion like this without recognizing that there's a worldwide attempt to suppress the feminine and to suppress women, and it is getting worse, not better. I know consciousness is rising on the whole planet. I can feel it. But at the same time, all you have to do is look at the US government and look at Trump and look at the number of supporters he has here and look at ISIS and look at what's going on around the world. Fundamentalism is where it is. Fundamentalism is a reaction to the fear body to change that is inevitable and that they don't want. And the writing is on the wall, but are we going to recognize that in the next years, we're going to see more attempts to suppress, more rapes of women in India, not less. Things are getting worse, even as consciousness is rising. And I just want us to recognize what we sit in. The cauldron is really heating up. I'm sorry, I had to say that.
I have a very small gift for you. Sorry, I just happen to have it with me.
Trump dump. Yeah,
Boy.
go ahead.
All right, we have one more question over here. Oh,
There was two.
two more questions. Okay.
Hi, I'm Dia Michaels, and I'm local, so thank you all for coming to my town. I was just hanging out with a midwife from Belgium, and the midwives do all the normal care there, and everything's, there's paternity, paid maternal leave, and all the things that we can only envy. And one of the things that women can choose is a home birth. So I was very impressed, and then they told me that if you have a home birth, it's a requirement that there be an ambulance sitting out in front of your house the entire birth. Right. And I just thought, what an amazing way to turn a positive into a negative, and what messaging of negativity and danger and fear, that one little thing where the good meaning people are telling you, oh, it's for the best. And it just reminded me of all the things that happen where it's good on the surface, and then you find the infusion of negativity and fear and insecurity. And I thought it might be an interesting thing to speak to the positives, but that women encounter and that families encounter in this whole process.
And I'd just like to point out, by the way, that Dia is standing next to a table. She is an independent book publisher and is actually on the front lines of trying to deal with social forces by changing narratives. So her books try to normalize attachment parenting, staying with your child, breastfeeding, birthing in non-hospital settings, and so on. So I encourage you to check them out. Maybe you'll want to get some. I don't know.
Thank you.
I would, did she have a question? I was wondering. Okay.
No.
I would just say something really quickly to respond to what you said. In Sweden, there was recently a trial where they had one-to-one care, which means every pregnant woman would get a midwife to care for her in a hospital. There was just an experiment. But eventually the hospital lost about 8 billion pounds in this experiment because it showed that there were lots of expenses being generated that were unnecessary, that could be solved by this problem. In the UK, I think, I'm going to say 2014, there was a study, there are several studies done, but recently, lots of headlines indicating that home birth is just as safe, if not safer in some cases, as hospital birth. And because they have the National Health Service, the state pays for health care. They're really looking for ways to cut their budgets. And so they give a stipend of £3,000 to those who choose home birth. Mm-hmm. So that, because £3,000 is actually not so much money for a birth. But when you get it in your pocket, you can realize that you actually don't need this exorbitant amount of money for a birth. But when we calculate births in most situations, you're looking at inflated prices. It's like going to a hospital. It's like going to the airport. You buy a bottle of water. It's going to cost you twice or 3 times as much. So that's just to look at your example or your reference to the ambulance.
We need to make sure
That's
that we leave
kind
time
of
for the last question.
if you're looking at a wider budget or national budget, those kind of things are actually cutting cost and not adding to cost. It's easy solutions, not, yeah.
Okay, we have one final question, so we'll have to be quick with the question and also with the answer.
It's a statement of fact, and you all can take it home and think about it later. It's a statement of facts, and you all can take it home and think about it later or talk about it later. In the year 2011 in the United States, according to the CDC, approximately 700 African American women decided to have babies in a birth center. During that same period, roughly 1,500 African American women decided to have babies outside of the hospital, either at home or in their car or wherever the baby fell out. So in 2011, we have approximately 2,200 African American women who had their babies outside of the hospital, out of roughly 540,000 African American women who had babies. In 2013, the percentages are the same. There are roughly 800 African American women who had babies in birth centers, and roughly 1,700 African American women who had babies outside the hospital, not in a birth center, totaling 2,400 African American women who had babies outside of a hospital, out of 568,000 African American women. So all of our talks about the movement in the United States in the year 2016, there are more women of childbearing age who look like me than look like most of you. And we have to change the face of birth because the face of parents who are having babies has completely shifted. The fear created by the continued unlearn the given, that anthropoid pelvises are pathologies, does a tremendous disservice to the majority of women who inhabit this planet, and plant a great deal of fear in the mother, a doubting of your ability as a human being, a doubting of the ability of the majority of people who inhabit this planet, that they really actually can have babies, though there's no place to park. So think about those things when here we have a different politics going on in the middle of an energy change that we really have to deal with.
Thank you all very much.
We're going to change mics with the